The rain tapped gently against the windows as Clara sat alone in the quiet of their home, the dim light of the living room casting shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to echo the turmoil in her heart, a heart that had been heavy for days. Weighed down by a secret she could no longer bear, she stared at the small vase on the dining table, at the single wilting flower she had placed there earlier, a token of normalcy in a day that had already begun to feel like a series of wrong choices. And she felt the ache of guilt pressing down like a weight she could not lift, thinking about Daniel, her husband, the man whose gentle eyes and patient ways had always made her feel cherished, loved, and understood, yet now, with a single lapse, she had betrayed the trust they had built over years, a trust that had once been unshakable, a foundation she had unknowingly begun to crack the moment she allowed herself to falter. She remembered the events of earlier that week, how she had been lonely in a way that surprised her, a quiet, gnawing emptiness that had made her restless even in the warmth of her marriage, and how, in a fleeting moment of weakness, she had allowed someone else, someone who offered attention and fleeting excitement, to cross the boundary she had always known she would never want to cross, thinking at first that it was harmless, a single lapse that could be forgotten, but now she realized that nothing about that day could ever be erased, and the memory clung to her mind like a shadow she could not shake, replaying in slow motion every glance, every word, every touch that should never have happened, making her stomach twist with nausea and fear of what Daniel might feel if he ever knew. And she had tried to convince herself that she could keep it hidden, that her careful steps and careful lies would protect the life they had built together, but deep down, she knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, that no secret, especially one as heavy as this, could stay buried forever, and that realization alone sent shivers down her spine as she imagined Daniel returning home any moment, his tired footsteps crossing the floor she had tried to keep clean, his familiar presence filling the house, a presence she now associated with the guilt that threatened to drown her. When the door opened that evening, and Daniel stepped inside, the warmth of his smile and the casual way he shrugged off his coat should have been comforting, but instead, every fiber of Clara's being tensed as he walked past her, carrying his briefcase in one hand and a small envelope in the other, the envelope that seemed too ordinary to hold the power to shatter her world, yet she could sense it radiating something unspoken, something final. And then the words came, soft, controlled, and devastating. "I know," Daniel said, his voice calm but heavy with hurt, and in that single instant, the air between them seemed to thicken, suffocating her as her mind raced, her mouth dry, her heart pounding like a drum she could not control, every possible explanation dying on her lips because she realized that nothing she could say would undo what had happened, and she felt the tears sting her eyes as she struggled to find words. But they would not come, and Daniel's gaze held her captive, steady, unwavering, filled with a pain so profound that it made her own guilt feel small, a fleeting shadow against the depth of his heartbreak. He sat down slowly across from her at the dining table, the envelope lying untouched between them, and in the silence that stretched like an ocean between two people who had once been inseparable, Clara could feel the invisible threads of their life together fraying, each heartbeat a reminder of the love she had jeopardized, of the trust she had broken, and she realized that Daniel's silence was more powerful than any accusation, more cutting than any shout or harsh word could ever be, and it forced her to confront the magnitude of her actions, to see herself clearly not as the woman she wanted to be, but as the flawed human being who had made a choice she now wished she could undo. She tried to speak, tried to explain, to beg for understanding, but the lump in her throat turned her words into choked whispers, apologies that felt inadequate, confessions that seemed to only deepen the chasm between them, and Daniel listened, his eyes never leaving hers, absorbing every word with a quiet intensity that made her feel naked, exposed, vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable, and in that gaze, she saw the hurt, the confusion, and the profound disappointment of a man who had given her his heart, and in that moment, she realized that love alone might not be enough to fix what had been broken, that some things, once damaged, carried scars that time alone could not erase. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing closer as the storm outside intensified, the rain now hammering against the windows in a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo her own racing thoughts, and she thought about all the moments they had shared, the quiet mornings with coffee in hand, the evenings spent wrapped in each other's arms, the laughter that had once filled these very walls, and she felt each memory twist with a bitter ache, knowing that those moments were now tainted by her mistake, by the knowledge that she had betrayed a love so pure and steadfast, a love that had never asked for more than honesty and devotion, and yet she had failed, had faltered when it mattered most, and the thought of losing him, truly losing him, filled her chest with a pain so sharp she could hardly breathe. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice steady but laced with sorrow, asking the question that would define the rest of their lives, asking if she still loved him, and the simplicity of it struck her like lightning, because of course she did, more than words could ever capture, yet she could not find the courage to say it, could not bring herself to bridge the gap she had created, and in that silence, the weight of their shared history, their love, their mistakes, and their uncertainties seemed to press down like the storm outside, heavy and unyielding, a force that reminded her that choices had consequences, and that some moments, no matter how brief or impulsive, could alter the course of lives forever, leaving only echoes of what had been, and the fear that even love might not be enough to repair the fractures she had caused, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her guilt, and the uncertain future of a marriage now suspended in the fragile space between forgiveness and heartbreak, as the rain continued to fall, relentless, unyielding, and unstoppable, much like the truth that had finally, inevitably, found its way into the light. Clara's mind spun in a whirlwind of fear and regret as the weight of Daniel's words settled over her like a storm cloud, making her chest ache and her thoughts race uncontrollably, each memory of her mistake colliding with the love she still felt for him, and she struggled to find something, anything, that could explain her actions, but the moment seemed too immense, too raw, for words to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, leaving her trembling as she watched Daniel sit across from her, silent but unyielding, his face a mask of calm that only intensified the power of his disappointment, the quiet of the room pressing against her ears, each tick of the clock like a drumbeat echoing her guilt, and she realized that the simplicity of their lives, once so comforting, had been shattered in a single moment, a fragile home now fragile not just in walls but in heart, trust, and the invisible threads that had held them together through years of laughter, tears, and shared dreams. She tried to speak, her voice breaking under the weight of emotion, murmuring that it was a mistake, that it had meant nothing, that she loved him more than anything, but Daniel's eyes, steady and unwavering, absorbed her words with a depth that left her feeling exposed and small, and in that gaze, she saw the hurt of someone who had loved fully and been betrayed, someone whose patience had been tested beyond measure, someone who now had to decide whether love was enough to survive the fracture she had caused, and she felt herself shrink under the intensity of it, wishing she could undo the past, wishing she could press a reset button on time and erase the impulsive choice that had thrown everything into chaos, yet knowing that life did not offer such easy reprieves, that the consequences of one moment could ripple endlessly, touching hearts and altering futures in ways she had never anticipated. Daniel's silence was profound, a weight of emotion so dense it almost became tangible, filling the space between them with an unspoken truth that words could not convey. And Clara felt panic rise inside her as she realized that every attempt to explain might only push him further away, that the trust they had spent years building could crumble into dust with a single misstep, and yet she could not remain silent, could not allow the distance between them to grow unchecked, so she reached out with trembling hands, attempting to touch his arm, to feel the warmth she had always relied on, but he drew back slightly, careful yet firm, and the gesture, small though it was, pierced her heart with the enormity of what had happened, showing her that even love could be fragile, that even the strongest bonds could falter when tested by mistakes, lies, and choices made in weakness. She remembered the nights they had spent talking about dreams, sharing secrets, laughing until tears came, and she felt the sting of loss before anything had truly ended, realizing that those memories now carried a bittersweet ache, a reminder of what had been and what might never be again, and she saw clearly that love alone, while powerful, could not erase pain, could not automatically restore trust, could only offer a chance for reflection, understanding, and perhaps redemption if one was willing to fight for it. And in that moment, Clara understood that she would need more than tears and apologies, that she would need patience, courage, and unwavering honesty to even begin mending the wound she had inflicted. Daniel finally spoke, softly, a question that seemed simple yet held infinite weight. Do you still love me? The words hit Clara like a tidal wave, and for a moment she could not breathe, could not respond, because the truth was so complicated, layered with guilt, longing, and shame, and she felt tears blur her vision as she nodded slightly, afraid that any other response might be wrong, might push him further into a place she could not follow, might solidify the fracture that had begun with a single mistake. And Daniel's eyes softened just a fraction, a small crack in the armor of grief he had built around himself, but it was fleeting, a reminder that love was not simple, that it required effort, forgiveness, and time, and that even the strongest feelings could not immediately heal the hurt caused by betrayal. Clara reflected on the past week, on the tension in her chest that had grown heavier with each passing day, on the nights she had cried silently, on the guilt that gnawed at her constantly, and she realized that love, no matter how deep, was intertwined with responsibility, respect, and trust, and that without these foundations, even the most passionate feelings could crumble under the weight of mistakes. And she felt a sense of desperation, a need to prove that her heart remained true, even if her actions had faltered. And she silently vowed to herself that she would do whatever it took to show Daniel that she still loved him, that she valued him, that she regretted the pain she had caused, even as she knew that he might never be the same, that the man she loved so fiercely might now see her in a different light, colored by disappointment and betrayal. Daniel's presence in the room was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of all she had lost, and all that might never return to the way it had been. And Clara struggled to reconcile her love for him with the guilt that threatened to overwhelm her, realizing that every word she spoke, every gesture she made, carried the weight of their shared history, the potential to heal or further hurt, and she felt the intensity of responsibility pressing down on her like a storm, relentless, unforgiving, yet necessary, a crucible through which she would need to pass if she hoped to see even a flicker of hope in Daniel's eyes again. The room seemed suspended in time, the outside world muted by the rain and the gravity of the moment, the silence stretching, filled with emotion too vast for words alone, and Clara felt her heart beating rapidly, each thump a reminder that life, love, and trust were fragile, delicate things that required care, attention, and unwavering commitment. And she realized that one misstep, one moment of weakness, could threaten to undo everything she had worked for, everything she had loved, and everything she had hoped to keep safe. She tried again to speak, her voice trembling, pouring out apologies, confessions, promises, but each phrase seemed insufficient, inadequate to convey the depth of her regret, the intensity of her love, and the desperate need for understanding. And Daniel listened, his face an impassive mask that concealed the turmoil within, a man torn between love, pain, and the desire to protect his own heart from further harm. And Clara watched him, feeling both drawn to him and terrified of the distance that now existed, and she realized that love, no matter how strong, was not a shield against the consequences of human fallibility, that mistakes, once made, had a ripple effect that could touch every corner of a shared life, altering it irrevocably. She thought about the quiet mornings, the laughter, the tender touches, the small acts of kindness and consideration that had defined their marriage, and the contrast to the tension now in the room made her chest tighten, made her wish she could freeze time, could step back, could undo what could not be undone. And in that wish, she found both hope and despair, a contradiction that mirrored the complexity of human emotion, the fragility of hearts intertwined, and the daunting task of rebuilding something once broken. Daniel finally spoke again, this time with a quiet finality that cut through the air like a knife, reminding her that love alone could not erase the past, that healing required action, reflection, and willingness to forgive. And Clara felt the enormity of the challenge before her, the long road ahead if they were to recover even a fraction of what had been lost, and she realized that this was only the beginning, that the days, weeks, and months to come would test their resilience, their commitment, and the depth of their emotions in ways she could not yet imagine, leaving her both terrified and determined, heartsick and hopeful, desperate yet willing to fight. As the rain continued to fall outside, a constant rhythm echoing the storm within, a reminder that life, love, and trust were never simple, never guaranteed, but always worth striving for, no matter how fragile or uncertain. And as she sat there, staring at Daniel, she understood that this moment, heavy with emotion, heartbreak, and possibility, was the crucible in which their future would be forged, and that every choice she made from this point forward would carry the weight of redemption, forgiveness, and the fragile hope that love, even after betrayal, could survive, endure, and perhaps, one day, bloom again. Days passed like heavy shadows over Clara's home, each one stretching longer than the last, carrying with it a silence so thick that it seemed to echo in every corner, reminding her constantly of what had been broken, and she moved through the rooms cautiously, her steps soft, almost fearful, aware that Daniel's presence, so familiar and comforting before, had transformed into something fragile, a tension that hung in the air like an invisible thread ready to snap, and she tried to fill the silence with small gestures, making coffee just the way he liked it, leaving notes of apology on the kitchen counter, setting out his favorite chair in the living room, hoping somehow that these quiet acts could bridge the distance, but each effort seemed to only emphasize the void between them, the gap that had widened with her mistake, with her betrayal, and she felt the weight of despair pressing down, a constant ache that would not let her rest, that followed her like a shadow as she moved through the familiar space of their home, now alien and tense. Daniel, for his part, navigated the house with a careful grace, deliberate and measured, his presence a quiet reminder of the life they had shared and the love that still lingered beneath the surface, a love now complicated by hurt and doubt. And every glance he gave Clara carried layers she could not fully decipher, hurt, disappointment, lingering affection, and a quiet, simmering resilience that made her heart ache with longing and fear all at once. And she realized that the man she loved had been changed by this revelation, not in the sense of abandoning love, but in the way he now approached it with caution, with boundaries she had never seen before, boundaries that both terrified and humbled her, reminding her that forgiveness was not automatic, that trust had to be earned again, and that love alone could not undo the pain caused by human imperfection. Each day, Clara found herself watching him closely, memorizing the curve of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the way he moved through the rooms silently, noting the small things she had once taken for granted, and each observation both comforted and tore at her, because she knew how precious and rare these moments were, how easily they could be swept away by her own mistakes, and she longed for a sign, any sign, that he still cared, that he still loved her in some quiet, restrained way, even if he could not yet forgive, even if the bridge between them was still fragile, suspended over a chasm of hurt and doubt. The nights were the hardest, when the house seemed to breathe with memories of laughter, whispered conversations, and quiet touches, and Clara would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Daniel, thinking of their life together, of the future she had hoped to share with him, and of how quickly that future now felt uncertain, slipping through her fingers like sand she could not hold, and she would cry quietly, trying not to wake him, feeling the sting of tears and the ache of longing for a connection she could no longer take for granted, realizing that every heartbeat was a reminder of love and loss entwined, of passion and pain, of choices that could never be undone. One morning, Clara found herself standing in the kitchen, watching Daniel silently as he read the newspaper, his expression unreadable, and she felt a pang of desperation to reach out, to touch his hand, to speak, to connect, anything to remind him that she still loved him, still needed him, still wanted to rebuild what had been broken, and she opened her mouth to speak, hesitated, and then closed it again, realizing that words, no matter how heartfelt, might fall flat, might even push him further away if they were not tempered with patience, humility, and understanding. And she felt herself shrink under the weight of her own guilt and longing, wondering if this was a punishment she could bear, a trial she must endure to earn even the smallest fragment of his forgiveness. The days turned into a blur of quiet gestures, careful movements, and restrained emotions, each one heavy with unspoken words, each one carrying the weight of love intertwined with sorrow. And Clara noticed that Daniel's small acts of presence, brewing tea in the morning, leaving a blanket on the couch where she might sit, placing a note on the counter to remind her of something trivial, were both comforting and devastating, because they showed that he still cared, yet the restraint in his movements reminded her that the bond they once shared had been shaken, that the foundation of trust she had taken for granted was now fragile and tentative, and she realized that every day was a test, a chance to rebuild or further fracture the delicate connection between them. Then came the morning she found the note, simple, folded carefully on the pillow where he had slept, and she froze when she saw it, the handwriting unmistakable, the words minimal yet heavy with meaning. I love you, but I can't stay. I need time. I need to heal. Goodbye. Her hands trembled as she held the paper, her eyes filling with tears as the room seemed to tilt around her, the reality of his decision hitting like a wave she could not resist, and in that moment, the quiet house, once full of warmth, seemed colder than ever, the walls echoing with the absence of him, with the finality of his choice, a choice that was not made in anger or vengeance, but in sorrow, in self-respect, in the quiet understanding that sometimes love alone was not enough to overcome hurt and betrayal, and that even the deepest feelings could not immediately restore trust or mend a wounded heart. Clara sank into the chair, holding the note to her chest, trying to make sense of it, trying to remember the life they had shared, the moments of joy, the whispered confessions, the quiet touches, and she felt the sting of loss like a knife twisting in her soul, a pain so intense that it made her shiver, her tears flowing freely, not just for him, but for herself, for the mistakes she had made, for the love she had almost lost, and for the long, uncertain road ahead if there was to be any chance at reconciliation. And she realized that Daniel's goodbye, though devastating, was not cruel, but an act of clarity, a pause that allowed both of them to face the truth, to reflect, and perhaps, in time, to heal, to find forgiveness, and to determine if love could endure beyond pain, a reminder that sometimes letting go, even temporarily, was an act of love in itself, a chance to rebuild stronger, wiser, more aware of the fragility and preciousness of connection. She thought about all the small things he had done over the years that now seemed like treasures she had nearly forgotten. The way he would make her morning coffee just the way she liked it. The quiet way he listened when she spoke about her dreams. The warmth of his hand on her back during difficult moments. And the realization that she had almost taken these things for granted filled her with a sorrow so deep it made her chest ache, and she promised herself that if he ever returned, if they could find a way back to each other, she would cherish every small moment, honor every gesture, and never again let a moment of weakness risk the bond they had built. Knowing now that love required constant attention, care, and integrity, Clara spent the following days in a blur of grief, reflection, and tentative hope, moving through the house like a shadow, feeling the absence of Daniel in every corner, and each time she looked at the spaces he had occupied, the chair at the table, the corner of the living room where he read, the desk where he worked quietly, she felt both pain and longing, a reminder of love that was still alive yet suspended in uncertainty. A love tested by betrayal, yet enduring beneath the surface, waiting for patience, understanding, and time to nurture it back to strength. And in that quiet, heavy grief, Clara realized that this chapter of their lives was not yet over, that heartbreak could coexist with love, that goodbye could be temporary or permanent, and that the future, though unclear, still held the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and a rekindling of the bond that had once defined their lives, leaving her alone with tears, memories, and the fragile hope that love, even when tested, could survive, endure, and ultimately find its way back home. Months passed after Daniel's departure, and Clara learned what silence truly meant, not the quiet of a peaceful room but the deep, echoing stillness that followed loss, the kind that settled into her bones and changed the rhythm of her days. And she woke each morning reaching instinctively to the other side of the bed only to find it cold and untouched, a simple reminder that the life she once knew was gone, at least for now, and she moved through her days with careful steps, returning to work, meeting friends, smiling when expected, yet carrying an ache that never fully faded, an ache shaped like the man who had loved her deeply enough to walk away when his heart could no longer bear the weight of hurt. And she spent long evenings alone, sitting by the window, watching the sky shift from soft gold to deep blue, thinking about the choices that had brought her here, not with denial or excuses anymore, but with honesty and acceptance, understanding that growth often came through pain and that love, real love, demanded accountability as much as affection. She began writing in a small notebook Daniel had once given her, filling its pages with reflections, regrets, and lessons learned, not to send to him, not to ask for forgiveness, but to understand herself, to rebuild the parts of her that had been careless, to become someone worthy of trust again whether or not he ever returned. And through this process she discovered a quiet strength she had never known, a resolve to face her flaws instead of hiding from them, to respect the boundaries Daniel had set, and to allow time to do what words could not. And though the loneliness remained, it no longer consumed her entirely, instead becoming a teacher, guiding her toward patience, humility, and self-awareness. Seasons changed, leaves fell and returned, and slowly, without her noticing at first, the sharp edge of grief softened, replaced by a steady calm, and one evening, while tending the small garden they had once planted together, Clara paused, hands covered in soil, and realized that she no longer felt only sorrow when she thought of Daniel, but gratitude as well, gratitude for the love they had shared, for the lessons learned, and for the quiet dignity with which he had chosen to protect his heart, and this realization brought tears, not of despair, but of understanding, because she finally saw that love was not proven by holding on at all costs, but sometimes by letting go and allowing both people the space to heal. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the yard, Clara found an envelope in her mailbox, simple and unmarked, and her heart stuttered as she recognized the handwriting, her fingers trembling as she opened it, reading slowly, carefully, absorbing each word as if it were fragile glass. And Daniel's message was not dramatic or emotional, but honest, telling her that time had given him clarity, that distance had helped him face his pain, and that while the hurt had not vanished, it no longer controlled him, and he hoped she was well, that she was learning and growing, and that perhaps, one day, they could speak, not to reopen wounds, but to understand each other as people who had loved deeply and been changed by it. Clara sat down on the steps, holding the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks as a quiet warmth spread through her, not hope in the sense of reunion, but peace, the kind that came from knowing that healing was possible, that forgiveness did not always mean returning to what once was, but sometimes meant releasing anger and embracing growth, and she wrote back, not immediately, but after careful thought, choosing words that reflected honesty rather than desperation, gratitude rather than expectation, and when she finally mailed her response, she felt lighter, as if she had set down a burden she had carried for far too long. Weeks later, they met in a small cafe, neutral ground filled with soft light and distant conversations, and when Daniel walked in, Clara felt her heart race, not with longing alone, but with respect for the man who stood before her, calmer, stronger, and quietly composed, and their conversation was gentle, thoughtful, filled with pauses and careful words, as they spoke not of blame, but of growth, of lessons learned, of the ways they had both changed, and in that moment, Clara understood that no matter what came next, this meeting itself was a gift, a chance to close a painful chapter with grace and understanding. When they parted that day, there were no promises, no dramatic declarations, only a shared look that acknowledged what had been and what could never be the same, and yet, as Clara walked home, she felt something close to hope, not tied to a specific outcome, but rooted in the knowledge that love had shaped her into someone more aware, more careful, more honest, and that even heartbreak could lead to wisdom and growth. And as the sun set behind her, she whispered a quiet thank you to the past, to Daniel, and to herself, knowing that while some love stories ended in goodbye, they still carried meaning, lessons, and the power to transform, leaving behind not just sorrow, but strength, understanding, and the quiet courage to move forward with an open heart, ready for whatever the future might bring.